Start recording. Good. Good. Well, good to see you all. Hope your power is on and you're not, well, obviously you're not out cutting down fallen trees, so good. Any questions before we begin our discussion of the debate over ratification, which is probably the most interesting political debate in the history of the country. So it's looking forward to what we have to say about these two pieces, James Wilson's speech of October 6th, and then the first essay of Brutus. And I know I asked a few folks to help out with the discussion, so I'm happy to turn it over to them, or I'm happy to continue pontificating. So let's see, I see Jeffrey, Brittany, Chrissy, and Paul are here from the pro and con teams. Does anyone want to start off, or?
I can start off by introducing James Wilson's October speech. So James Wilson was a Philadelphia lawyer and statesman. He served in Congress from 1775 to 77, 1783, and 1785 to 86. Mm-hmm. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he advocated in favor of strengthening the powers of the central government throughout the 1780s. Mm-hmm. Wilson played a major role at the Constitutional Convention. He delivered 168 speeches. Only one person at the convention delivered more than he did. And he was a member. Who was
that, Chrissy? Who delivered more?
It was Governor Morris. Okay. And he was a member of the Committee of Detail, which prepared the first draft of the Constitution. And he also assisted Governor Morris in putting the Constitution in its final form, as well as the committee. Mm-hmm. He was also the first convention delegate to defend the Constitution publicly. In one of his speeches, the October 6th speech, which he gave at the Pennsylvania State House at a public meeting in 1787. He discussed the Constitution and its principles, which I will turn over to my group members who has that prepared.
Paul, we can't hear you. Or James, we can't hear you. Was someone else going to say something about James Wilson's speech?
Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I just joined. I joined a little late. Sorry about
that.
All right. Yeah, sure. Here. Just give me one moment. All right. Yeah. So James Wilson's speech. So in about the first half of his speech, he talks a lot about the lack of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. So one of the quotes that I wanted to talk about with you guys is the quote, "Everything which is not reserved is given, but in the latter, the reverse of the proposition prevails, and everything which is not given is reserved." So I just wanted to ask you guys what you guys thought this meant and if you agree with it. And I will post it in the chat. Yeah, Giovanni?
I think this quote, it's pretty like simple in what it means. It's kind of like giving the vice versa, where it says everything which is not reserved is given. It means in the situation where we're reserving powers, like from something, everything that we're not keeping from it is given to it. But then where it says the reverse also prevails and that everything is not given is reserved. In the situation where you're giving powers, like what they're doing in the Constitution, those powers which we're not giving are reserved. So basically, if we're keeping powers from something, everything else we're not keeping from it goes to it. But if we're giving powers to something, everything we're not giving is kept from it. It's kind of just like the different perspectives there.
Yeah, right. So he's saying basically every right not given to citizens expressly by the Constitution is reserved by the state government.
Well, wait. I think we're getting ahead of ourselves. What is the it we're talking about where something is given or reserved, and who is it that is giving or reserving things? I'm not sure. There, you've mentioned there are two things. It's a vice versa, but I'm not quite sure what the vice is, what the versa is about. He says in the first, it's everything not given is reserved, and then in the second, it's the opposite. But I'm not quite sure what the first and the second are.
Is this a question for me?
No, it's a question for James, Giovanni. I don't want to have you answering.
Yeah, sure. I was wondering that too. So he's saying just the rights, such as the right to like a free press. So in the beginning part, he's everything which is not reserved is given. He refers to the rights that are reserved by the state governments through their individual like Bill of Rights and their own constitutions. And then in the second part, but in the latter, the reverse of the proposition prevails and everything which is not given is reserved. He is basically saying that it's not necessary for the federal government to declare this because it's reserved already by the people inherently.
So what is the latter he mentions? But in the latter, what is the latter? James, you've isolated what really is the critical quote in Wilson's entire speech. And I'm not trying to beat you over the head with it, but I'm not quite sure everyone understands what it is he is saying, because it is this, the latter. You've gotten to it that the state constitutions are one thing, the federal constitution is something else because of this.
So I believe the latter is referring to the Constitution as it is proposed.
Okay, that makes sense. So in the state constitutions, everything that is not reserved is given, he's saying. So if people in the states have withheld certain powers from their state governments, it means they've given every other power to it. But the federal constitution is the opposite, that if the people of the United States did not cede certain powers to the federal government, then they withheld them. I'm thinking that's what he's saying. Is that what you think he's saying?
Yeah, that's exactly what I think he's saying. Does anyone else sort of want to speak to it, or?
Does that make sense to other people? First, we should ask, and then we can see if anyone wants to speak to it. Or if someone can put it more simply than either James, Mr. Wilson, or I have. Okay, you can go on, James. Sorry.
No, thank you for that. Yeah, so sort of in support of that quote, I had just kind of jotted this down, that he says, James Wilson says, it would have been merely nugatory to have introduced a formal declaration upon the subject, nay, that very declaration might have construed to imply that some degree of power was given, since we undertook to define its extent. So sort of just kind of saying that in declaring a Bill of Rights, it would be sort of giving the power to the government to restrict these in the future. So then in the first half, he later goes on to kind of talk about trial by jury. He also, another major thing that I wanted to ask you guys about is the keeping of the army during peacetime. So he says, still the declaration must precede the preparation, and the enemy will be informed of your intention, not only before you are equipped for an attack, but even before you are fortified for defense. And I'm going to throw that quote in here. So I just wanted to ask you guys, if you agree with that, do you think the government should, in the context, obviously, hold a peacetime army, or if you think this is appropriate? It's not letting me copy and paste. There we go. There we go. Yeah, so how do you guys feel? Do you think the government should be holding a peacetime army? Yeah, Matthew, go ahead.
So I would say that it's important for a country of any size to have some form of a standing military. For the context of this situation, the 13 colonies were all relying generally on their own militias to form a defense, and I think it's rather logistically difficult to have 13 different militias all coordinating together. Rather, having a central national defense would be better for an overall situation for defending the other states. Obviously, the militias aren't going away, but I think having a unified central armed force would do better to bind the country together than to rely on 13 individual state militias.
Yeah, right. That's good, Matthew. Does anyone else have anything to say, any opinion on that? Or
I think, I think we kind of went hurriedly through the first part, the whole powers not given or reserved. And I think we made it clear what Wilson thought about that. I don't think people expressed themselves on his, I don't know if you were planning to get to this later on, or if someone else in the group was going to get back to this, because it's a very important thing he is saying about why you would not have a Bill of Rights, because that would imply the government has power over these things. So by leaving it out entirely, you are saying the government can't do anything about freedom of the press or trial by jury or these other things that people are gassing on about, religious freedom. I mean, where is there anything in the Constitution about these things? He's saying if you introduce a Bill of Rights, that is going to imply the government has power over these things. So I'd like for someone other than James to think about this and express a thought on it, because it's a very important argument that he's making about why a Bill of Rights is not only unnecessary, but dangerous.
yeah, and to the effect of what Professor Allison's saying, I can provide another quote that sort of talks about what you're saying. So
Yeah.
you guys want to think about that and sort of,
Trevor.
So I feel like his logic is suggesting that it would be better to enumerate the things that they could do rather than what they can't do. And I feel like if you had, it's the reason that we have the Bill of Rights is to have those protections so that government can't impose its will in those specific areas. If you try to do it the opposite way and say exactly what they can do, then their power is too limited and they can't act.
But isn't what he is saying is that they have said what the government can do? That is, Article 1, Section 8 lays out what they can do, and thus there's no reason to limit other things that it can't do. You seem, by the way, to be saying you like a government that has expansive powers, which I think Wilson would agree with you. Just wondering if those who may feel they want a more limited government would agree with that formulation you and Wilson have just made. And I hope I'm not taking a position on this issue about expansive government, limited government. Trevor, I was asking you to follow up.
I'm sorry, could you rephrase what the question
Okay.
was then?
So you said if you just list what the government can do, it's going to be too limited. But that seems to be what Wilson is saying as well. He said this is limited because Article 1, Section 8 spells out what the government can do. And so there's no reason to put in what it can't do because there's a limited number of things it can do. I don't know if this is getting too complicated or too beyond the realm of our comprehension, the argument that now he and I are making.
So I feel like it definitely gives like a good protection on, or it's nice to have it listed out, because if you don't protect against certain things, then there's interpretations of broader laws that could empower them to take advantage of a people. So I feel like
Have what listed out?
that is, the Bill of Rights provides a
Yeah.
answer
Yeah.
for people that want small government.
Yeah, but when Wilson's making this speech, he's explaining why there isn't a Bill of Rights, why there shouldn't be a Bill of Rights. So he would be on the other side saying we don't want a Bill of Rights because that's going to open up too much power for the government.
Maybe he's swaying me then.
Okay, good. I think, Paul, you have
Yeah, so I'm gonna get into this a little bit later, but I think the presence of like the necessary and proper clause or the elastic clause in the Constitution, and just the governments, as we've seen, like I know we're looking back now, but just the fact that the government has expanded itself and its powers through that clause shows that listing a Bill of Rights back then was a necessity, because without that, the government has expanded into making judgment on those rights. And without that Bill of Rights, we wouldn't have those protections. So I know that's a very backward looking view of it, but I think just like the argument of just saying, oh, we just listed what the government can do doesn't protect those innate rights that we should have protection from. Just basically looking, and I know Brutus argues for this, is the necessary and proper clause can lead to an expansive government. So therefore we have to enshrine our very important rights first.
By the way, does everyone know what the necessary and proper clause is? Where is it? I'll ask anyone who's nodding his or her head to tell us.
Isn't it also section 8 or section 1, article 8?
Article 1, section 8. Yeah, we probably should have spent more time going over the Constitution itself before we got into the arguments of it. So Article 1 sets up the legislative branch. Section 8 is the powers of the legislative branch, and Section 8 of Article 1 has a list of the powers Congress has. So the Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, comma, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, semicolon. Okay, so this provokes a discussion. Is this sentence two separate clauses, or is it one? That is, does Congress have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, as well as the power to pay debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States? Or does it have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, etc., in order to pay the debts, provide for the common defense and general welfare? So there's an argument here. Does this mean Congress has the power to provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States? Because if it has the power to provide for the general welfare of the United States, how come then there is a list of specific things Congress has the power to do, since you've just said it has the power to provide for the general welfare, which could mean just about anything? I mean, that's one of the big arguments we're going to have about what this means. And it's an argument we've been having since then, but 1787 and 88, before anyone knew how it was going to work, there's that argument. And then at the end of the list in Article 1, Section 8, it says, this is the elastic clause Paul was referring to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof. So here's a list of things Congress can do but it can also do anything else that is necessary or proper to carry those things into effect. And with both of these things, general welfare and is the power to levy taxes in order to provide for the general welfare, or is the general welfare clause an additional power? And this one, what is necessary and proper? Who is the judge of what is necessary and proper? Or what is the scope of Congress's power? Javon, it looks like you're talking, but we're not hearing what you're saying.
Yeah. I guess it would be the Supreme Court, but I'm pretty sure this is before Marbury versus Madison. So
Oh, yeah,
traditionally-
definitely. No, nobody has heard. No, we've heard of
Yeah.
Madison at this point. Haven't heard of Marbury or of a Supreme Court because we haven't even gotten to that yet. So, so the question is, who decides what powers Congress has according to this?
It would seem like it's Congress.
Okay.
Because there's no body that would do it because the Supreme Court doesn't have that power yet.
Yeah, and there's no real sense the Supreme Court will have that power. Yes, Haley.
I agree. I would say it's Congress, and it's vague in order for them to really skew the law into what they need it to mean.
Okay. So since our friend Wilson was just saying that any power not given is reserved, how confident are we that that's actually true reading this? Yeah, Javon?
Yeah, I would say I'm not very confident. The problem is a lot of what Wilson's saying is, sure, it's implying a limit to government power, but implicit limits aren't very good for the ultimate governing document of a nation. Like, so long as it's implicit, it can kind of be ignored or moved around. If they included the line, and I think either Wilson or Brutus mentions this, that they should include a line explicitly saying that everything not given to Congress is reserved, as is in the Bill of Rights. If they included that, it'd be fine because it's explicitly there. But even then, that would kind of serve to the limit. Like, well, sure, it says it's there, but so long as Congress is still the arbiter, Congress can just expand its power whenever it wants. Like, there's no real check on it there. So I'm very much against the whole implicit check there that Wilson seems to think is fine.
Okay. I hope we haven't completely convinced Trevor, because I hope there are still some advocates here for an expansive power of the federal government, and that we haven't bullied Trevor into changing his mind, or anyone else for that matter. Who is James? I'll let you pick this up. Sorry for the digression.
No, thank you. I think that was very valuable. So I'm actually going to pass it on to Jeffrey now, who's kind of going to talk about the second half of Wilson's speech for us.
Yeah, so basically in Wilson's speech, in the first half, he basically focuses on how the Bill of Rights is not necessary because in a system of federal government, powers are given specifically to the national government. And any power that's not given is reserved to the people. And in the second half, he basically responds to like the anti-federalist question of how the federal government would basically annihilate or end the powers of the state government. And one quote that I picked out was that basically talks about how Wilson views like the federal power. It's, we will comprehend to the government of Pennsylvania the existing unions of the states, and even this projected system is nothing more than a formal act of incorporation. And I'm just gonna copy and paste the quote into the chat. And what I got from this quote was basically that Wilson was emphasizing the point that federal government has enumerated its powers through state government, and you can't have a federal government without having a state government first. So basically, the structures of the federal government is reliant basically on having like a state system first. And just like to go off of that, he dedicates like an entire basically section about how the state powers are not annihilated due to the federal powers. And one of the quotes that I picked out was that the House of Representatives is composed of members chosen every second year by the people of by the people of several states, and the electors in each state shall have qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature, unless therefore there is a state legislature that qualification cannot be ascertained, and the popular branch of the federal constitution must likewise be its state. And I'm just going to copy and paste that in the chat. And the question I just have for the class would be, what does this tell us about the relationship between the federal and the state government? Go ahead, Paul.
Yeah, I would just say that Wilson is saying that the relationship would be very active under this system, as the federal government wouldn't be able to exist or do any of its duties without the state government, because as it says, it relies on like electors and for the state legislators to actually choose members of the federal government. So therefore, the notion that the federal government would destroy the state government is moot because it can't operate without the state government.
Yeah, that's basically what I got out of it. He's basically talking about how I guess we use the electoral college, like without the electoral college, which is basically made out because of the state government structure, then the federal government wouldn't have the power to actually exist unless you have like the state to let it exist, basically. And one other quote that I got from basically the end of the speech was that if there are errors, it should be remembered that the seeds of reformation are sown in the work itself, and the concurrence of 2/3 of the Congress may at any time introduce alterations and amendments. And basically talking about how the federal government, if there is a problem with whatever they enact, they can always repeal it. And it just basically emphasizes the point that the federal government is not put in place to get rid of the state systems. And that was basically the second half of Wilson's speech.
So were you convinced, Jeffrey?
I mean, some parts of his speech I would say are like convincing, but I agreed more with Brutus' point of like not. It's more about like the fundamentals of like the structure rather than just the structure itself.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. So where do we go from here?
So now I think Brittany is going to talk a little bit about Brutus 1 for us.
Okay, so I'm going to be doing some background info on Robert Yates, who is the presumed author of the Brutus writings.
How do we know that? Who presumes that?
I'm not too sure. That's just what I found when I researched.
Because no one knows who Brutus was, and some have suggested maybe Yates, but others have said maybe not Yates. So I don't think it's a question we know the answer to. But anyway, tell us about Yates.
So for Yates, he was born in New York on January 27th, 1738. And as a student, he studied law and soon entered the bar. And he was known as a anti-federalist, one of the like major leaders.
Wait a minute. I mean, we've throwing around the word anti-federalist, and I don't think we know what it means. I mean, you're not the first one to use it, so I'm just curious when that word gets coined, and when do people call themselves anti-federalists? I'm not meaning to pick on you, Brittany, for bringing it up. But,
I'm not too sure when people started to use that, but I know that that's what people referred to him as.
what people? I'm not just making Brittany answer for the crowds of people running around calling people anti. Yes, Mitchell.
Would the anti-federalist term start being used after the ratification of the Constitution, when kind of like the first political factions started to be formed, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, Federalists being, I guess, the party of John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and then Anti-Federalists being those more along the lines of Thomas Jefferson?
Okay, so that's interesting. So that would mean then that in this period before the Constitution is ratified, you wouldn't have had anti-federalists, I'm thinking. That's an interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, Paul, do you have something to add?
I was under the impression that the two predominant political parties that came out after Washington's presidency were the Federalists, which was John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and then the Democratic Republicans led by Jefferson and Carew. I think the term anti-federalist might have come out of that era, but it's in reference to people who opposed the ratification of the Constitution without Bill of Rights and stuff during the ratification debate era.
Okay, so then this is two different things. I mean, Mitchell's saying it comes about afterward, and you're saying it comes about before. Okay, so where does the word federalist come from then? I mean, before you can have someone who is anti something, you have to have something that someone presumably was for. Brittany, I'm not trying to hold you up. You wanted to tell us about Yeats, and here we are getting bogged down in talking about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. What does the word federalist mean? Yes, Trevor.
I think
It's a great echo.
a federalist would be somebody who supports a strong federal government. So somebody who believes that the states should all like act as one.
Okay, but that seems to be the opposite of what a federalist would want. A federalist would seem to want to have the states acting as sovereign entities under a confederation, which they had. So the people who supported, like Wilson, wouldn't really want the states to be acting as sovereign entities. He wants to have a strong central government as opposed to a confederation, which, I mean, this gets, I think, unnecessarily confusing, but I think in order to understand the whole debate, we really need to grapple with this whole problem of what we're calling these people. Jovan?
Well, in this context, I'm pretty sure Federalists are simply people who believe in the ratification of the Constitution and the formation of that federal government, where the Anti-Federalists are against the ratification of the Constitution as it is. I'm pretty sure the term Federalist came out first, and I'm pretty sure it's connected to the Federalist Papers, which came out in support of the Constitution. I'd assume Anti-Federalist was a term kind of reactionary to that, where we're the Federalists, and if you don't agree with us, you're against us, therefore you're an Anti-Federalist. So
Yeah,
I'm not sure.
I think you're on the right track. By the way, I think everyone here is on the right track. And you're probably trying to guess where I want this particular train to go so that you can make sure you're on the right track. But yeah, Paul, before I weigh in and tell you where the train should go, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, well, I know federalism is just the idea that power should be separated between the state governments and the federal government,
Yeah.
and that there should be a balance of powers. So
Yeah.
I think in this context, people who are arguing for the constitutions think that there should be a more equal balance of powers between the federal government and the state government, and anti-federalist means that most of those powers should be reserved for the state governments.
Okay. I think you've gone way beyond the realm of that would be useful in a political context, but I think you may be right. Yes, Haley.
I was just going to say that I think the word Federalist really came from the Federalist Party and those who believed in Hamilton's vision for like a strong central government.
Okay, so so we've gotten pieces of this, which is good, and I'm sure there's someone lurking there who hasn't said anything, who knows all of this. So, but Pelatiah Webster wrote a pamphlet I didn't ask you to read because there's really no point in you reading it, which is one of the first arguments for ratification of the Constitution. And he makes a point of calling it a federal constitution, and the supporters of it are Federalists. He says this not necessarily because it is true, but because, remember, during the convention, the big argument was state power versus national power. And I always called people like Hamilton, Wilson, Madison nationalists because they wanted a national government as opposed to a federal government. And they create a system that is partly federal, partly national. If they had come out of the convention and said, we have created a national government. Remember, the Virginia plan says a national government ought to be established, a national legislature, a national executive. I get choked up just thinking about a national judiciary. Had they come out of the convention with that particular idea, it wouldn't have gone anywhere because the American people did not trust a national government. They thought power should be held by the states. They saw that the system they had wasn't quite working, but the idea then we're going to scrap it and create a national government wouldn't have gone anywhere. So the proponents of the Constitution make the conscious choice of selling it as a federal government, which is why Pelatiah Webster calls the proponents Federalists, and it's a federal constitution. And if you are against a federal constitution, or if you're against this constitution because you want power to be held by the states, and by the way, if you're someone who thinks power should be held by the states, what would the name be for you? What are you if that's your particular ideology? Someone who believes power should be in the states. I think one of you just explained this. A couple of you just explained this. Proponents of state power versus national power. What would you call someone who proposes? Yes, Trevor.
A Federalist.
You're a Federalist, exactly. Yeah. So you're a Federalist. You want a federal government. And now here you have Pelatiah Webster saying this is a federal government, and James Wilson saying it's a federal government. So, you know, I don't know. You could get up on some soapbox and say, no, it's not really a federal government. We're the real Federalists, but they've taken the name and are running with it. And so you were really stuck. By the way, at this time, no one involved in the debate who was against ratifying the Constitution called themselves anti-federalists. They were against the Constitution. They were against ratification, but they knew they actually were Federalists. And then it goes further. When, you know, in someone's already mentioned the essays that Hamilton, Madison, and Jay wrote, and they wrote them under the name of Publius. That is, a lot of these characters have pseudonyms. Some of them we know who they were. Some of them, like Brutus, we don't know who they were. And in the spring of 1788, after, you know, Hamilton, by the way, had asked Gouverneur Morris to write some. John Jay was going to write a whole bunch. James Madison was going to write some. It turns out Jay gets sick. Gouverneur Morris never does anything. So Jay writes about 5. Hamilton and Madison together write about 16 or 17, and then Madison writes about 15 or so by himself, and then Hamilton writes the rest. And they published 78 of them in newspapers, beginning in like November of 1787, and then in May of 1788, Hamilton takes all the ones published in the newspapers, writes about 7 more, and publishes them together in a 2-volume edition, which he calls The Federalist, and kind of taking the name. And the opponents, Matt, it looks like you're about to hold up a book to show us. The Federalist Papers. Yeah, great book. Okay. Well, I have it here somewhere. This is the problem when you move offices. You can't find your books anymore. So I will never again know where my copy of the Federalist is, but it's somewhere here. I'll find it later and we'll email you a picture of it to show you that I actually have a copy of it here. But this is it's a great political act that they do, taking the name Federalist and using it as their title. Now, by the way, here is a tip. I know many of you are interested in politics and may one day get involved, maybe already are involved in the political process. People tend to vote more for someone who is for something than someone who is against something. And if the only thing you have going, by the way, I am more likely to vote for someone who's against things than for things, but I'm in a minority. You're going to get more traction if you actually have a plan. And this is what we want to do. You just say, no, we don't want to do that. Well, then what do you want to do? Anyway, we're getting into a political discussion here. But Pelatiah Webster takes the name Federalist and uses it to great effect. And proponents of the Constitution, who actually are nationalists, we call Federalists, even though, as we've all just explained, they're nationalists. And thus the opponents, who actually are Federalists, are really kind of stuck. And we can dismiss them as a bunch of cranks because they really weren't for anything. They were just against things, just a bunch of tiresome naysayers. And we really like the government as it's emerged. So I'm sorry, Brittany, you want to tell us more about Yates and Brutus?
Yeah. So kind of continuing on, Yates was a Supreme Court justice and was actually Chief Justice from 1790 to 1798 for New York.
What? Oh, New York,
Yeah.
not the federal Supreme Court.
No, for New York. And he was also really well known for attacking the Constitution for the ratification for it through his Brutus writings. And he also ran for New York governor, but lost. And
If in fact he wrote the Brutus writings, he would have been noted for attacking the Constitution.
Yeah. And he died on September 9th, 1801. And just a quick summary and information about Brutus 1. So it was presumably written by Robert Yates, and it was published on October 18th, 1787 in the New York Journal. And pretty much he talks about how he doesn't like the idea of unifying the United States into one big republic. He prefers the smaller democratic state governments, and that if we were to ratify the US into one, that our liberties would be threatened, and that his issues with the Constitution are that it gives the federal government too much power, which he doesn't like. And the idea that I'm going to focus on is how he really wanted the people to be involved with the ratification debate. And there's a quote that he says, let me put it in the chat. So he pretty much talks about if the people get involved and choose to ratify a good constitution, then life will be good. But if they choose to not take part or understand the parts of the Constitution and ratify something that wouldn't be good, it would harm our society. And there's especially at the end where he says this only remaining asylum for liberty will be shut up. So my question for you guys would be, what do you think that he's saying here when he talks about it? And what do you think he means by remaining asylum of liberty?
No thoughts on that? What about that point about posterity will execrate your memory? That's really pretty strong about what's going to happen if you vote for. Yes, Paul.
Yeah, basically saying your children will hate you.
Yeah. Yeah, what about, is this going to shut up this asylum for liberty if you create this? I mean, that's really a pretty big warning about what is going to happen. So.
I actually also have another quote that would kind of bounce off of that. He mentions in the beginning, which is right here, which he pretty much says you want to accept a constitution that will have all these great things so that your future generations will be blessed and that they will appreciate your efforts. So like another question kind of based off of that is like what do you think Yates would think about the Constitution and how generations today are affected by it? Like, do you think that they did a good job with ratifying it and like how it's treating us future generations today?
Very interesting question.
If not that, I have another quote that's shorter and simpler. And it says, "But remember, when the people once part with power, they can seldom or never resume it again, but by force." So he's pretty much saying, like, if you guys don't participate now and like ratify something that is what you want, then later on it's going to be hard to change. So like my question for that would be, what do you guys think about this point and like events that are going on today, and like how today we're trying to force like changes on things that we don't like?
Well, before we get to today, I think that's an interesting quote to compare with what Wilson was saying about the seeds for change are there. That is, you have this way of changing it if you don't like it. And here Yates is warning, or Brutus is warning, that it's going to be very difficult to change. Once you cede this power, you're never going to get it back. That's really a pretty powerful warning. And by the way, do you get the sense from this, Brittany, that Yates is entirely happy with the way things are in the country at the time? Or does he think there may be need to change the system?
I think from this, he definitely has some changes he would like to make, because he's really putting this warning on that, like, once it sticks, it's not gonna like be undone. And so he has that like fear that if his ideas really aren't being like supported through the Constitution, then he's kind of gonna like live with things that he doesn't agree with. Paul?
Yeah, I think he's like okay with how things are right now. Like he's not like he recognizes it's not perfect. He thinks that the Constitution or the Articles of Confederation should be amended a little bit, but I think his main reason for putting the warning in this Brutus is basically saying, if we pass this Constitution, it will devolve into something way worse than what we have now. So we should focus on making small changes to what we have now and not pass this Constitution, which will lead to tyranny, lead to a huge republic that will consume all of us and take away our liberties.
Yeah, that's a good idea. V?
On it, either for me, my interpretation, Brutus wants to keep things the way they are as far as within amongst the power amongst the states. But then when I look at it from the previous writings, and for the ratification of the Constitution and not the ratification of the Constitution, when you really, to me, it doesn't make a difference whether the states have more power or the power is given solely to the government. Either way, at the end, if something is not right, it's going to resort to enforcing power or tyranny, either amongst themselves by the state or against the government to get their point across. So whether they do before they do the Constitution or ratification, the power is still going to be there, but still amongst the states as opposed to just amongst the government. Corruption is still going to be there. That's how I see it.
That's a good point. Giovanni?
Yeah, I just like to say, I kind of agree with what Paul said about how he's really concerned about, he realizes the system isn't perfect, but he's concerned about making it worse. And that seems to be his biggest point there. Like at this point, America's kind of its own thing. It's not bound to one of these greater empires. It doesn't have this long history. It doesn't have like this myriad like web of laws to like restrict people's actions. So I think he's taking a really good and interesting point. I really like the question you raised. It's just, I feel like he kind of gets into this problem where he's saying, well, we can't change anything because then it'll get worse. Like, yes, there's the possibility of that, but I think if we look at it now and how he's trying to relate it, I think a lot of our rights kind of, there isn't like a diminishment of rights for things like the NSA and like loss of privacy, which can be a problem. But I think his seeking to preserve rights is like ultimately a good, my point's kind of getting jumped, but I think his seeking to preserve rights is ultimately a good thing. And his like this desire to maintain liberty is probably one of his best points. Like, yes, if you squander what we worked so hard to achieve, your children will hate you for it. And they probably would. It's just, while I see this as a good way to refute some of the problems of the Constitution, I don't see it as this perfect negation of the point. Sure, things could be worse, but at least with the quotes that are here, it's not true that once power is lost, it can never be regained without force. We kind of saw this with like prohibition. Sure, it was taken away, but there was no forceful uprising to get back the right to sell alcohol. It came back. People were strong enough against it. There was enough flaws with the amendment for it that it got overturned with another. So I don't think his argument here is perfect. I think if there is another oppressive system, the Constitution as it is contains enough stopgaps that it's possible to overcome it without force. So I feel like my point's kind of lost, but
I think that was well put.
Yeah, basically, I like what he's saying, and I agree with enough of it that I think he makes a good point. But ultimately, the Constitution has enough systems, and it's not like the Constitution's immutable. It has enough ways that it can change that any oppression that it brings about can theoretically be overturned. So I guess what I'm trying to say. I might have veered off the question a bit. I apologize.
That's a good point. I had kind of a question for you from that. I know you mentioned like the prohibition is kind of an example, but what about like other examples like that people really had to fight for example, like the women's movement and like getting the right to vote? That was nowhere in like the Constitution and things like that, but women really had to fight and protest and like fight really hard in order to kind of push that. Do you think examples like that, like what do you think about examples like that when it comes to what he's saying?
Well, for that, it kind of gets into more what he means by force. Like women's suffrage, there wasn't a war to win women's right to suffrage. So, and sure, there was political force brought about. There was like force of like oratory force and force of verbiage, but there was never a war. If you wanted to kind of go more on what he's saying, the Civil War kind of makes a good point for it. Where it's like, yes, the right to liberty was taken away. The only way you're going to get it back is through a war, and that's what happened. That was really the only way it was going to come back. Whereas for women's suffrage specifically, I don't want to say no blood had to be shed because I'm not that sure of the specifics, but no great like physical combat was necessary to bring about women's suffrage. So in that case, I want to say this still kind of goes against him. You didn't need physical force to bring about rights in that sense. I guess, does that answer the question? I might have.
Yeah, I can see like you're focusing on force is like more of like physical, where I see it more as like not physical, more like kind of fighting and protesting and things like that. Like that's what my interpretation of like by force, because that's like a lot, like especially today, that's how a lot of changes are made. It's kind of like that force, that push by like people's like movements and things like that. So that's an interesting point. Anthony?
Not to stay on this too long, but just you know, going back to prohibition for a second, there kind of was a lot of force in that there was so much gang violence, you know, like, and so if you wanted to drink alcohol, you had to participate, not in being a gangster, but you had to, you know, drink it at places where it was illegal, and there were raids, constant raids. But not to, I know it's getting off topic, but in a sense there was force.
Well, also, I think prohibition is also the reason we have a Federal Bureau of Investigation. I mean, created for that, and it's something, when prohibition goes away, it doesn't, but it has to keep finding things to do. So that's, yeah. And I think you're right to use the term force in the way you are, because Brutus certainly sees this as a government that will have force. And it was interesting, V seems to be a real pessimist about this, and Giovanni seems to be a real optimist about this. But yeah, it is, we're creating a government that is going to have this power. And how will you control it seems to be the question. And Wilson is kind of saying it's no big deal. And on the other hand, Brutus is saying it is a big deal, and not really anticipating perhaps prohibition or other things, but it is creating a government that will have force. And then how will you get it to give up that force? I mean, imagine, you know, and Giovanni mentions the NSA, which is another of these institutions created in response to a particular problem, and then has to keep finding things to do. I'm sorry, now I am starting to rant, and I apologize. Brittany, you want to take us back to the rational world?
Yeah. So if anyone doesn't have any more points or questions, then I'll pass it on to Paul so we can talk about his ideas.
Yeah, so my focus, which was a big part of the Brutus argument, was about the elastic clause, and about how just listing out the powers of the Constitution, or of the federal government under the Constitution, and then having this clause, which we've already kind of talked about, basically saying anything necessary and proper to fulfill those duties falls under the jurisdiction of the federal government. Brutus is saying that this allows for the federal government to just like take over all the powers that would be supposedly reserved for the states. So I have this quote here, kind of long, but it's basically just explaining what I just said, that if we give the federal government these powers and to do anything necessary and proper for carrying out their execution, then the government will just take over all these powers and become a republic and abolish the state legislatures. So I just wanted to get your guys' opinions. Do you think the federal government has used the necessary and proper / elastic clause and taken over some of these powers that the states should have in our current times? And do you think this is like a reasonable critique by Brutus? Or do you think that so far the federal government has stayed within its jurisdiction and hasn't abused its power? Yeah, Giovanni.
Well, to start out, I don't think any government body has ever fully stayed within its own enumerated powers. They've always tried to expand it. So in this case, I like to say, yeah, if you reference something like, say, US v. Lopez, basically what Congress did is it tried to use the Commerce Clause to enforce a criminal legislation, which is pretty far beyond its powers. Criminal prosecution and lawmaking in that sense is generally left to the states, as it's, at least that's how it's supposed to be. But I think we've seen enough example of Congress specifically trying to go beyond what is normally supposed to be limited to the states. So I think Brutus makes a good point here. Yeah, if you give Congress such broad and rather undefined powers, it's going to use them to go beyond what should be its normal jurisdiction. So I agree with him in this case. Yeah.
Does anybody else have any opinions on that? Because I'm partial to what Giovanni just said. Yeah, Anthony.
I'm kind of in the camp with V a little bit, that a little bit pessimistic in that I do think that even if you know, if you obviously a federal government has more could have more power. But there's nothing stopping the state governments from passing like horrendous legislation that violates people's rights either, you know. I guess it just comes down to how much power you give them. And I think being cautious about that is good. So I agree with some of the founders in that sense who wanted us to be cautious about it. But yeah, I am in that pessimist camp. I still think it would get out of control either way.
So would you think, by the way, are you counting Brutus now among the founders, even though he's opposed to?
No, not Brutus specifically. No, but no, I know he's not. I'm just.
Yeah, so I agree. I agree that you got to be cautious, and that we've seen Congress use its powers and this clause specifically to expand that powers. V.
Yeah, going back off of what was basically what was said. To me, isn't the reasoning for presenting the ratification before the Constitution is to keep the corruption that has already existed among the 13 colonies of some of the assembly, that of the powers within the assemblance or the assembly that has gone on. So isn't this why this ratification is now being proposed, to take away the overstepping of state powers that shouldn't be, to put it into a more controlled government environment, which is why we're trying to propose ratification for all of the colonies and the states to follow, as opposed to it being separate and everyone's following their own rules, which they've already done. And look at some of the corruption and the mobs that we've already read about that has started. So isn't that the purpose of doing this?
So you're saying that ratifying the Constitution and including this clause will take away some of the corruption in the state legislatures?
Exactly. And because that's what we've read about before we've come to this step to propose the ratification, is the colonies each individually doing something that is all separate from each other, where they should be on the same page, and some of the assembly powers have overstepped those boundaries. So this is why we're here proposing ratification for all the colonies. That's how I see it.
I see what you're saying. I don't know if I specifically agree with that, because I feel like that's just proposing abuse of power to account for abuse of power. So, because if the state legislatures are stepping out of their bounds, I don't think we should allow the federal government to step out of its jurisdiction in order to account for that state legislature corruption.
But isn't that why the federal government has now broken it down into the 3 legislative branches, to each one has the oversight of each other instead of the states? There's nobody oversighting the state assemblies once they've gone to that one particular president of that assembly who is doing the corruption over the whole state.
I think you make a good point. I mean, the reason for this is because of corruption in the states, but then Brutus's fear is that this is going to create this new entity when there won't be any way to check it. So.
Yeah, so Giovanni, you got one last point before I turn it over to Melissa?
Yeah, I kind of want to go more on what V was saying. I think the biggest point she's making is that the federal government would check the states, and then the states would sort of check the federal government. I feel like that's not what the Constitution effectively does, though.
Mm-hmm.
Like the federal government, for all of its supposed weaknesses, as was being said earlier, like I forgot the guy's name. Sorry. For all of its supposed weaknesses, there's no real effective way for the states to check the federal government. At least under the Constitution, there's not much the states can really do. Sure, they can come together to try to make a constitutional convention and then change the Constitution, but that's not really feasible for all except the most gross transgressions. Whereas this federal government has like the supremacy clause, and it has all these other powers over interstate interaction. Sure, it can't really manage within the state as well, but it just has such a grasp over all of the states that I don't really think there's much of a checks and balances both ways. I guess if for V's point of the federal government checking the states and preventing their corruption, it sort of does have that ability. It prevents states from like raising tariffs on one another. But I don't think it's as much of a balance as it would be between, say, the legislative branch and the executive branch, which are much more equal in that sense. The federal government just seems to be a lot more powerful than any individual state or even a significant group of states. That's what I had to say.
And Brutus seems to be saying that the Constitution is going to make the states irrelevant, no matter what James Wilson says about you need them for the Electoral College and so on. Here he's saying that they are going to be eradicated.
Yeah, so if nobody else has anything on the necessary and proper clause, I'm gonna turn it over to Melissa to finish talking about Brutus.
Okay, so Brutus was talking a lot about like his opinions on like having a standing army, and he basically like very much opposes the idea of like maintaining a standing army to like execute the laws. And do have a quote, but he basically argues that having, you know, he's basically arguing that all right, that like having like a federally controlled militia will ultimately lead to the violation of the rights of the people. And they do that by like insinuating fear in order to like get people to comply with the government, basically. And I'm trying to quote, he said, "Men who, upon the call of the magistrate, offer themselves to execute the laws are influenced to do it either by affection on the government or from fear. Where a standing army is at hand to punish offenders, every man is actuated by the latter principle." So based from that, he's basically saying that like people are inclined to follow laws because like they're either loyal to the government or they're afraid of punishment. And he's saying that it's usually people being like afraid of punishment. So like people are more inclined to act in motivation of like fear. So that pretty much in itself like ruins the state of freedom. And kind of like fearing punishment, he's like afraid that it would turn people against the law and even like isolate their support towards the government, which is like not ideal in like a free republic if a standing army were enforced. And he also brings up the point that you kind of need, you have to like depend on the support of the citizens in order for like them to like execute laws constitutionally. So another quote that he had was, that I can also send. So a free republic will never keep a standing army to execute its laws. It must depend upon the support of its citizens. But when a government is to receive its support from the aid of its citizens, it must be so constructed as to have the confidence, respect, and affection of the people. And I thought that was interesting. He's saying that, like, you know, as long as like, he actually made a point about how like in like the British monarchy, for example, they heavily relied on Parliament for their support. But like there have always been complaints of like the system being like oppressive and corrupt, and that they were rarely used to execute laws, unless it was like the civil magistrate that like directed them to do so. So yeah, I thought that was a really interesting take on the idea of like how like using like fear to control people and to get them to like stay loyal to the government in a sense, and like how like that is like the biggest like violation of like personal liberty. And I guess like I was wondering if like anyone like agrees that like having a standing army would lead to like that direct of a violation of people's rights, or if like, you know, maybe it could work under certain circumstances. But I don't know, like that's kind of like what I took from his argument. But if people have like any like other takes on it, or if they agree or disagree with him.
That's a good point. And I'm sorry we cut off James, who was about to get to James Wilson's explanation for why a standing army was necessary. Because here you have two very different ideas about a military force. You know, Wilson saying, absolutely, we need one. And then Brutus saying, no, this would be dangerous and actually would be destructive of liberty. So it seems like we've hit now these two polar opposites here in this discussion about creating a government and the need for force. And it's, you know, how it will be controlled. And a standing army, is it going to make us obey the government out of fear, as opposed to through the confidence, the other things Brutus was saying it should have?
Yeah, so I don't know if does anybody want to like speak on that, or yeah, Paul.
Yeah, I would say Brutus is kind of very optimistic about the current government, and that people just obey the laws because they want to obey the laws and they love their nation, and that they have no fear for it, and that this constitution would institute them having fear if they don't obey the laws. So I think it's very interesting to see that he's basically saying fear is going to be a driving factor in why people obey the laws if we adopt this constitution, whereas right now it's just people obeying it because they're patriotic.
Abigail?
I always viewed the like anti-standing army like ideas as a big reaction to like the Revolutionary War, like having just happened. And I do think it would be interesting to see like if the Revolutionary War wasn't so violent, like if this sentiment would still exist or if it would be different.
Interesting. You know, actually, the fear of standing armies goes back actually to the 17th century. And a standing army means something in particular. That is, it's a permanent military force. And the first ones were maintained by the king. And the reason I think Melissa was saying the king relied on Parliament to pay for things, and paying for a permanent military force, which is why, for example, did those of you who read the Constitution know that the clause on Congress's appropriations for the military, Matthew's nodding his head. What's the limitation? In Article 1, Section 8. To raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years. So they're trying to prevent Congress from creating a permanent military force or a standing army. And here Brutus is arguing that Congress will find a way around this and will create a standing army without this 2-year appropriation. There's also the thing about to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws and organizing and arming and disciplining the militia. So not without looking at the elastic clause, we see here that Congress does have the power to create a military force and also to arm and discipline the militia, which means the state organizations for defense are actually going to be under the control of Congress. So suppose you have a Congress that does the things Brutus fears a Congress will, the states won't have any recourse because You know, the Congress might create a permanent military force for itself and then say, okay, we're going to arm the state militias with sticks and arming it, and can move a militia from, say, Massachusetts somewhere else. There's a fear that the militia from Massachusetts might be sent to Georgia to put down slave rebellions, as Congress also has to provide domestic tranquility. So you have all of these other fears in here about what the government could do. And in our discussion, I think we saw that some folks think Congress has done some of these things and think the others are far-fetched. And Paul did a good trick the Federalists would have done, saying Brutus really has too much confidence in the state governments. And, you know, we know, as V said, the state governments are cesspools of corruption. So why is he so in love with them? I mean, that's you guys should run for office. I think you really you're catching on to how to win arguments by, anyway. This has been very interesting. I think we're almost out of time, and we'll have to continue with the ratification debate next time. But congratulations to the 6 of you who really helped to elucidate these 2 writers or speakers, Wilson and Brutus, whoever Brutus may be. And we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Take care. Good job.
Professor, I have
Yes, sir.
So
Let me just turn off the recording.
Yep, go ahead.
Okay.